currently a Mellon, American Council of Learned Societies Fellow, and who received her PhD in art history from the graduate school here. She will consider how outsider religious attitudes of late 19th century theosophists who manifested a syncretic interest in all religions, as well as engaging such previously unaccepted concepts as occultism and mysticism, how these attitudes mingled with late 19th century symbolist theories of a universal correspondence between the arts. An important aspect of her paper will be how these two currents formed a significant climate for a key belief of modernist painters, the concept that colors and lines could convey moods, even without clear definable images. That concept enabled, for example, Vasily Kandinsky, the major theorist and painter of expressionist abstraction, to maintain that modernism, even in its most abstract forms, could convey meaning. The title of his book, On the Spiritual in Art, published in 1912, and you're looking at a image that was taken from the original German edition, Überdisgeisterte in der Kunst. This was published in 1912. At any rate, this book, and its title, is testament to his faith in the metaphysical and cosmological properties of much of experimental modernism. Dr. Berkowitz will specifically focus on how the German painter Fritz Ascher, often labeled as an expressionist modernist, used color to transmit mood. Following Dr. Berkowitz will be Dr. Matthew Drutt, who received his PhD from Yale University, has curated numerous exhibitions about European modernism, especially Russian, and is currently head of the company Drutt Creative Arts Management. Dr. Drutt will explore how the Jewish heritage of the Russian constructivist L. Lissitzky supported his positive views of the newly formed Soviet Union, and as a result permeated his abstract paintings and prints of 1919 to 25. Although the works of Lissitzky and those of Kandinsky appear quite diverse visually, both intended their artifacts to generate a cosmological and utopian transformative effect. Dr. Drutt's paper is unusual in its willingness to tackle the problematic mixture of the metaphysical and the political. The last speaker, Dr. Ori Soltes, the Goldman Professorial Lecturer in Theology and Fine Arts at Georgetown University, has written numerous books on Jewish art. He will also discuss aspects of the spiritual in modern art, in his case by specifically examining some of the recurrent Jewish and Christian themes in the paintings of Fritz Ascher. I want to say that far too few historians connect an artist's anxiety about his religious identity to the anti-naturalism of his work. To counter this missing link, Soltes will explore the cultural, religious, and political issues that might have contributed, especially the metaphysical properties of much of experimental modernism. So Soltes will particularly explore the paradoxical situation of how an artist from a Jewish background dealt with images and themes connected with both Jews and Christians. So, to sum up, in this panel, you will hear 3 papers about how attitudes toward religion, occultism, mysticism, as well as politics, contributed to the transformation of narratives about much of European modernist painting from its previous focus on the aesthetics of style. However, negative discourse about the impact of these attitudes still obscures widespread acceptance of these ideas. But you, as an audience, will have a chance to make up your own minds. So perhaps you might wish to jot down any thoughts, especially if you have questions. Now, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Berkowitz.
Good evening. I wanted to thank Rachel Stern for inviting me to speak, to Abigail, to my fellow panelists for their papers, to Ricky Long for moderating, and to my former home base, GC, for hosting these talks. So, despite the extensive work done by Rachel Stern for this exhibition and for others, there is much we will never know about the artist Fritz Ascher. While oral histories, Ascher's poetry, archival records, and his surviving works scaffold the artist's biography and artistic motivations, critical gaps will always remain. For instance, though Ascher and his family were persecuted under Nazi Germany for their Jewish heritage, all by that time had left Judaism and/or converted to Protestantism. Was the family's conversion merely in keeping with the contemporary social mores of assimilated Berlin Jews? Or was it a conversion that coupled spiritual feeling with opportunism? Did Ascher, regardless, hold on to a sense of Jewish identity? And can or should we read paintings or drawings such as this one, with a religious Jew seemingly ostracized from a converted, possibly a converted relative's funeral? Should we read works such as these in relation to a potential Jewish identity? From an artistic point of view, early works which might have formed critical bridges between and among Ascher's artistic shifts were destroyed during the Second World War. Today's art historians might wonder about other French painters, aside from Henri Matisse, seen here, whose works Ascher might have emulated, significant early color studies that might illuminate Ascher's post-war landscapes, or perhaps other visual testaments to the artistic impact of Ascher's connections with the German avant-gardes. The silence of the unknown and never will be known with Fritz Ascher becomes even more glaringly apparent when we try to make sense of those works that do exist. In paintings like Golgotha or The Tortured, the absence of obvious guideposts to translate clearly symbolic or significant compositional decisions leaves today's viewer adrift. However, if we accept the premise that we may never know the complete and definitive story of Ascher or of his work, tonight I want to examine the interpretive breadcrumbs that Ascher did leave for future viewers to follow. Focusing on clues in The Tortured, I will argue that we should be able to read some of Ascher's works as experiments in ideological color. Theosophical and occult-related theories on ideological color were embraced by the artist's mentors, like Edvard Munch, as well as by his contemporaries, like Vasily Kandinsky, Pete Mondrian, and Hilma af Klint. So, Ascher painted the tortured sometime in the 1920s. The piece depicts a central blue nude male figure with red-orange hair. He is shown bound with rope and restrained by 4 nude figures: an older red-orange bearded man at the bottom left foreground, a younger yellow man with red hair, a seductive purple woman with green hair, and a slightly menacing green woman with red hair at the bottom right foreground. The scene occurs within an enigmatic blackened landscape interrupted by multicolored bands and dots. The tortured combines common techniques and forms from Ascher's visual lexicon. Ascher's use of monochromatic color coding for figures can also be found in, for instance, horse and rider, male nude carrying female nude, Sisyphus, and Golgotha, among other examples. Likewise, the bodies and faces in the tortured were archetypes found in other examples of Ascher's work. For instance, the older man in the tortured duplicates the form, features, and red body of Ascher's kneeling male nude, as well as the Temptation of St. Anthony. The tortured's purple woman's profile echoes striking profiles in Ascher's Inferno, Golgotha, Temptation of St. Anthony, and even perhaps the death mask of Friedrich the Great with the woman's pronounced nose and closed eyes. The yellow man finds parallel in Bajazzo and Artists and Loner, while the green, red-haired woman echoes figures in The Temptation of St. Anthony, Sisyphus, Inferno, and even a sketch of Beethoven. What makes The Tortured a particularly important representation of Ascher's pre-war compositional tropes is the fact that here, unlike in other examples, the organization of the tortured's composition ensures that viewers understand which choices merit focus and are significant. Unlike in Inferno, for example, where the chaotic scene and overabundance of characters obscure any definitive comprehensible narrative, or in Loner, where the single form provides too little visual data to assign context or meaning. Ascher's logical organization of the tortured's monochromatic figures enables the viewer to decode the story and offers clues as to where to go next for interpretation. For instance, the centralization of the blue male nude and his larger size in comparison to the surrounding figures indicates that the tortured story begins with the man's bondage. However, looking at how Ascher rendered this man's form qualifies the nature of his restraint, and therefore the story the tortured intended to tell. Ascher emphasized the man's musculature, and in particular, the bodily strength implied in the rendering of his clenched, enlarged hand. Should this man wish to escape his bonds, these representational choices indicate that he would easily have the physical capacity to do so. In combination with the man's closed eyes and the otherworldly setting, one can therefore infer that the blue man's restraints are not physical, but perhaps internal and emotional. In addition, in combination with the diverse physiognomies of the 5 bodies, Ascher's decision to assign each person a non-naturalistic signature color underscores his or her individuality and distinctiveness. If the painting depicts an internal psychological struggle, then the surrounding bodies can be collectively interpreted as figments of the central man's imagination, with each representative of a particular category of torment. What this torment might be, the missing link connecting the composition to its implied narrative, is decipherable only if we accept that Ascher's monochromatic palette for the bodies can be interpreted symbolically. Support for this perspective can be found by looking at the prominent influence of Norwegian avant-garde artist Edvard Munch on Ascher's artistic development. Around the time he painted The Tortured, Ascher began his personal connection with Munch. In 1914, Ascher and the artist Frans Domscheit traveled to Norway, where they met Munch in Oslo. Ascher also later hosted Munch in his home in Berlin. Ascher's affection for Munch remained for the duration of his career, and Ascher even dedicated a poem to Munch while he was in hiding from the Nazis. Ascher may have already had contacts with or admired Munch's work prior to 1914, as Munch had shown in Berlin since 1892 at the Society of Berlin Artists, and was active in the Berlin progressive circles of the pre-World War I era. The Berlin Secession, of which Munch was a member, was actually established in 1898 as a response to conservative backlash to Munch's work, a reaction that led several artists to leave the society. Artist Max Lieberman, whose interconnectivity among international cultural figures helped establish Germany as a crucible for 20th century modern art, helped found the Berlin Secession. Lieberman was a mentor to Ascher, providing another connection point with Munch during Ascher's formative years. It was Lieberman who granted Ascher an art diploma in 1909, and who that same year recommended Ascher, at the age of only 16, to study painting in Königsberg at the Academy of Art, an institution whose director, Ludwig Dettmann, incidentally, was also a founder of the Berlin Secession, making the Munch connection continue. Munch moved to Berlin in 1901, and his work profoundly influenced the younger generation of German expressionist artists, notably those of the Brücke. Ascher, whose friendship with the Brücke group not only played out in the technique of his pre-war paintings, but also in the subjects of his post-war work, likely socialized with Munch at the same time as the Brücke expressionists were circulating through Munch's Berlin lodgings. The elements of German expressionism, then, that inspired Ascher may have just as equally been testaments to Munch's influence. Underscoring Munch's artistic influence on Ascher suggests that Munch's interest in theosophical and occult ideological color may provide a framework to interpret the tortured's symbolic color. Like Ascher, Munch rendered his figures using non-naturalistic, monochromatic color coding, particularly in his prints. This color coding was a function of Munch's view that color signified emotional states, feelings, or worldviews, a perspective consistent with the philosophies of late 19th century theosophical circles, which was recently explored in a 2017-2018 National Gallery exhibition, Edvard Munch, Color and Context. Theosophy was an outgrowth of 19th century spiritualist ideas, which emerged as ideological counterweights to rapid industrialization and increasing materialism. Founded in 1874 in New York by Russian emigre Helena Blavatsky, Theosophy soon gained traction abroad, with notable theorists and proponents in the British Annie Besant and the Austrian Rudolf Steiner. According to scholar Maria Carlson, Theosophy, quote, united religion, science, and philosophy into one grand synthesis that explains everything, end quote. Theosophy's core belief was that there exists a single universal occult tradition, which was known as the secret doctrine, on which all religions, past and present, are in part based. Common to Theosophy and its sister occult movements was a belief in the underlying duality of the universe, a belief that the universe was comprised of polarities that were always in tension. Hence, Theosophical-inspired art often dealt with the juxtaposition of male and female, light and dark, vertical and horizontal, and warm with cool colors. Such art aimed to use these visual signals to bring viewers closer to an understanding of the universe. As a visualization of the invisible forces of the world, theosophically grounded art desired to induce an epiphany in viewers, or illustrate a utopia possible through a turn to spiritualist principles. Popular visual expressions of such occult beliefs included the use of symbolic forms and colors, increased abstraction or complete abstraction, use of sacred geometry, attempts at synesthesia, notably visual art aspiring to the conditions of music, and cosmic imagery. As other scholars have noted, it is not a coincidence that the preponderance of occult viewpoints and movements like Theosophy occurred as a consequence of or in tandem with scientific developments, like the 1895 discovery of X-rays, that quite literally unveiled the visible world's previously hidden secrets. Now, theosophical authors were concerned with the artistic representation of theosophical principles from the outset, and were particularly interested in the potential for color to play an active part in this visualization. Annie Besant and C.W. Leadbeater's 1901 Thought Forms and Leadbeater's Man, Visible and Invisible both contained a color chart entitled Key to the Meanings of Colors that assigned emotional values to various color combinations. In Thought Forms, the authors noted that, quote, Emotional changes show their nature by changes of color in the cloud-like ovoid or aura that encompasses all living beings, end quote. The experience of emotion then leads a person to throw his astral body into violent agitation, giving off a flush of color that, quote, corresponds with the rate of vibration of that particular emotion, end quote. In Besant and Leadbeater's work, red symbolized anger, animal passion, and sensual desire. Green was adaptability and sympathy. Orange was pride or ambition. Yellow, intellect. And blue represented an ideal. Blue to Besant and Leadbeater indicated religious feeling, an unselfish heart, or union with the divine. Violet, a mixture of blue and red, equally mixed affection with devotion. Now, key to note is the fact that thought forms associations between color and emotion were not unique to theosophical theory, nor were they particularly innovative. What is significant about the occult programs that assigned mystical and emotional values to color is how it connected emotional associations with color to a statement of an entire worldview. In this occult thinking, if the visualization of a person's emotional auras was critical to unmask the foundational components of the universe, then color was not merely an accessory to form, nor a material to be valued for its own sake in a Greenbergian sense, but rather an autonomous actor integral to the construction of a composition's meaning, and capable through its signification alone of demystifying how the world works. Munch's engagement with ideological color can be traced to his early years in Norway, when a traveling medium established a scientific public library in 1886, across from where Munch and his painter friends would meet. He furthered his interest during his early years in Berlin between 1892 and 1895. At this time, Munch became close friends with Swedish author August Strindberg, who was deeply interested in the occult and practiced alchemy, and Polish musician and author Stanislaw Przybyszewski, who gave Munch Spiritualism and Animism by Russian spiritualist Alexander Aksakov. Munch was familiar with Besant and Leadbeater's writings, including thought forms, as well as other occult texts. When Munch went to Paris in 1896, the artist added symbolist ideas to his occult aesthetic motivations and remained connected to the French circle around Strindberg. Symbolists like the Navy relied on geometric symbolism indebted to Blavatsky's ideas, indicating the pervasiveness of theosophical thought among basically many, if not all, of the avant-garde movements at this time. Munch's ideological color also integrated Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's 1810 theory of colors, which argued that each color brings its particular mood, with the deep purple the most unsettling, and the combination of green and red an ideal. Munch additionally relied on Michel Eugène Chevreul's scientific approach to color theory, favored by the Impressionists. It was this concert of inspirations, occult ideologies, Goethe's texts, scientific innovation, and symbolist thought that resulted in Munch's aspiration to represent the inner life and spiritual world, rather than faithfully record external reality. This concept is exemplified in the works of his Frieze of Life series, one of which is shown up here, in which Munch explored hidden spiritual dimensions of experience. The connection between Munch's work and its inspiration in ideological color theories was publicly recognized and accepted as early as 1894, and the color theories of Goethe and the theosophical writers have proven key to understand some of Munch's often enigmatic imagery. Going back to that recent exhibition at the National Gallery, the curator of the National Gallery Munch exhibit on ideological color, Jonathan Bober, has, for instance, interpreted Munch's 1896 woodcut man's head and woman's hair according to theosophical color schemas, describing the woman's brown and orange coloring as representative of selfishness and sensuality, with the man's green implying sympathy, thus leading Bober to conclude that Munch's color choices alone suggest that the thrust of the narrative is that this is the woman's callous disregard for the man's love. Now, Munch was not alone in his pursuit of ideological color. Interest in imbuing color with philosophical significance predominated among pre-war avant-garde circles, notably in the work of Vasily Kandinsky, the Puteaux Circle, and as recently showcased in the Guggenheim exhibition, artist Hilma af Klint and her female circle of mediums, the Five. Kandinsky's work was famously influenced by the Russian symbolists and the theosophical writings of Besant, Leadbeater, Blavatsky, and Rudolf Steiner. In his Concerning the Spiritual in Art, Kandinsky, using theosophical terminology, described the psychic effect of color as color, quote, produced vibrations in the soul, end quote. Consistent with symbolist and occult views, Kandinsky associated blue with infinite, peace, and heaven, white with a soundless tranquility, and green with an ideal balance. For Af Klint, her abstract and abstracted figurative canvases attempted to visualize an occult paradise. Af Klint joined the newly formed Swedish Theosophical Society in 1889 and established with 4 other women a study group for mediumship called the Five, during which Af Klint was directed by high masters to depict messages and drawings received through seances. Af Klint later was influenced by Rudolf Steiner, who gave his views on her art, and she spent many years doing research and study at Steiner's Goetheanum in Dornach, the hub of Steiner's anthroposophical movement, which was a deviation from Theosophy. Interest in occult-inspired symbolic color remained prevalent in the interwar, circumscribing the abstractions of Piet Mondrian and the De Stijl movement, as well as Kazimir Malevich and the Suprematists. Mondrian, under the influence of both Goethe's color theories and his association with the Dutch Theosophical Society, derived his idea of neoplasticism from an attempt to write a theosophical treatise of art. He then transformed his more direct, theosophically inspired canvases, like Evolution, 1911, into his neoplastic abstract system, in which dualities and a reduced color palette aimed both to illustrate the underlying energies of the universe, as well as aspired to a universal vision. Even when De Stijl was at its peak, in 1921, Mondrian still maintained his theosophical roots, writing to Rudolf Steiner that neoplasticism was, quote, the art of the near future for all true anthroposophists and theosophists, end quote. So, to return to Ascher and his ideological color. If we place Ascher among this distinguished company of peers and predecessors, each using color as not merely an eye-catching call to the avant-garde's non-naturalism, but rather equally or more so as a statement of symbolic meaning, how then could we read The Tortured? One possible interpretation views the inner struggle of the central figure as a quest to realize his ideal spiritual potential amidst the conflicting forces of vice and other unsavory impulses. The central male figure, strong, able to physically but not emotionally break the restraints that hold him, is blue, the color of religious fervor, divinity, and spirituality. His tormentors then include uncontrollable anger or passion, in red. His intellect, yellow, holds him back from realizing the spiritual ideal. The purple woman, as desire and devotion, is a distraction that whispers in his ear, or an unsettling influence if you follow Goethe. The slightly menacing monstrous woman is rendered in Goethe's ideal color combination, the peaceful equilibrium of green, threatened or tempered, depending on your read, by the menace of red passion. That individuals of varying ages and genders should manifest the central male figure's inner psyche only confirms the occult links between Ascher's color choices and a symbolic color palette. As theosophically inspired art, the duality of the universe was often expressed as the alignment of male and female principles. We may never know with certainty if Ascher relied on occult-inspired color theory in The Tortured and other works, but I would venture to say that based on the evidence we do have, this contextualization of Ascher's The Tortured merits consideration. Acceptance of this interpretation, however, raises several questions. In the main, how does this line of thinking impact our readings of the rest of Ascher's work? Namely, his later post-war landscapes, which increasingly veer to abstraction, deliberately remove figures, and use color as a narrative driver of each scene. Should we align works like Sunset, seen on the screen, with the evolution of Ascher's pre-war peers and predecessors like Kandinsky and Mondrian, who took spiritualist, symbolist, and theosophical ideas to an abstract or almost abstract conclusion? Can works such as Ascher's 1920s Portrait and Golgotha and Pageant be understood as using color to represent a theosophical aura? In the absence of documentation to suggest otherwise, should we also attribute sufficient weight to the occult or theosophical line of influence via Munch and the German Expressionists to assume that Ascher's interest in ideological color continued after Ascher emerged from hiding, his artistic influences then stunted and frozen to a time before his persecution? Similarly, if we place Ascher's work among the proponents of ideological color and ideological abstraction, in a panel devoted to spirituality, how does this shade our understanding of Ascher's works on both Christian and Jewish religious subjects? If he was operating along the paradigm in which color and line underscored the spiritual impulses present among all religions, both Eastern and Western, can or should we read any personal religious belief into his depictions of Golgotha, Christ, or the Golem? Or should we instead see Ascher as using these narratives as signifiers of stories possessing deep spiritual import or significance, but whose meaning should be derived less from content and more from the manner in which this content was rendered? These questions may remain forever unanswered, but I present them to you here as food for thought. Thank you.
Discussion of Lissitzky in Russia, in what was then the Soviet Union, and I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Drutt.
I'm not a doctor, but I did play one on television once. And I'm also old. Good evening. Lissitzky is the most widely collected and exhibited Russian modernist in the West. In his short lifetime, he traveled frequently, especially to Germany, where he built and maintained close relationships with numerous artists of the European vanguard, many of whom he collaborated with. During his lifetime, he had at least 5 solo exhibitions outside of Russia, thanks largely to the mercurial efforts of his German wife, Sophie Kuppers. Beginning with the publication of his first lithograph portfolio, the Kestner Gesellschaft, where she was the artistic director. In 1923, Lissitzky Moskau Schauder Arbeit at the Grafisches Kabinett E.B. Neumann in Berlin in 1924, which is his famous poster for it that you see here. And this rare photograph of his installation at the Gallery Kuhl and Kühn in Dresden in 1925, again arranged by his wife Sophie, who did many shows that year at this gallery, with the assistance of collector Ida Bienert at Gallery Goltz in Munich. Ida Bienert was a very important Jewish collector in Germany at the time. And course, at the Bauhaus in 1927. This is actually Joseph Albers' photograph from a year later of Lissitzky, which is exemplary of the kind of photography Albers was making at the Bauhaus at that time, also not widely published, unfortunately. Lissitzky was a compelling public speaker, fluent in German, and hence was invited to lecture widely in Europe, not only about his own work, but as an advocate for other Russian artists and the political ideals of the burgeoning Soviet Union. His gregarious personality attracted people to him, so did his passionate idealism and his enthusiasm for various burgeoning artistic styles, such as suprematism, constructivism, Gestalt, and later even his shift to a more conservative form of expression under Stalin. They all found broad support, and he maintained a progressive divergence from the status quo, which is to say, he was able to be a conservative artist and widely accepted nonetheless, which we'll come back to in a minute, not in a minute, but we'll get there. It's not therefore surprising that in the wake of his death, no fewer than 18 solar shows have been organized to date, only 3 of which were in Russia, none of which includes his numerous exhibitions, designs, and none of which includes his numerous exhibition designs and pavilions in Europe, like his famous Crown Room in 1923, and culminating in the International Fur Trade Exhibition in Leipzig in 1930, nor does it include the group shows where he had significant presence, which were almost too numerous to quantify. In spite of this widespread recognition, sparse attention has been paid to his early Jewish works, in either Western exhibitions or scholarship, with a few notable exceptions being Hyman Abramsky's and Peter Nisbet and Ellen Birnholz and Christina Lauder. There are many, especially designs like this, for Moshe Brothers Scroll, A Legend of Prague, published in Moscow in 1917. 1917, the year of the Russian Revolution. However, Jewish imagery is considered altogether absent once he embarks on the path to non-objective art. Initially under Kazimir Malevich's tutelage in Vitebsk in 1919. This is Lissitzky in his studio in Vitebsk with his abstract pictures in the background. Okay, 1917, 1919. Try to keep years in your head because we're going to go back and forth. Despite the fact that he's still working like this in 1922 under the clear influence of Marc Chagall, who was also there at the same time. And there is a little competition between, I don't know if it was really a competition, but it's always described that way, between Chagall and Malevich for the influence over Lissitzky. Who doesn't want to claim, credit for their prize student, right? I certainly have. Indeed, in keeping with the Western bias for sanitary modernism, like Ricky showed in her beautiful map, the nature of Lissitzky's identity in the West is that of an incredibly prolific abstractionist, even by Alexander Konsetikis, whose 2017 book on Lissitzky's Jewish period stops in 1923 with his last Hebrew and Yiddish graphic works, and admits his abstract paintings almost altogether except for this one, which he and I will have a drink over someday and discuss. Indeed, he writes, quote, Some scholars, including especially Alan Birnholz, have argued that Lissitzky's later work continued to be very heavily influenced by Jewish motifs and traditions. In the opinion of the present author, such interpretations are exaggerated. End quote. He says this in spite of the fact that as he and I worked on this publication, and I was his general editor, Kenseticus vehemently advocated against assigning finite dates to the so-called Jewish period, arguing that it was a recurring issue in Lissitzky's work, unconstrained by time and chronology. And that's what put me onto this paper, even if it's not well thought through yet. For many in the West and East, Lissitzky's artistic identity is slippery. He moved quickly from style to style in a polymorphous practice that embraced painting, typography, design, photography, and architecture, eschewing movement after movement as he absorbed ideas and moved on from them. This earned the ire of some of his mentors and colleagues, even as they admired his passion, especially like Chagall, Malevich, Schwitters, and Van Doesburg, who ultimately felt Lissitzky had abandoned them after being a faithful adherent to shared ideals. While Lissitzky expressed contrition when these colleagues expressed their disappointment in his serial independence, he never let go of the resentment of the prejudice against his Judaism, though it was gradually expressed quietly and subtly. He had wanted to study architecture at the St. Petersburg Academy, but he was rejected. He maintained throughout his life that it was because of the Jewish quota. Instead, he was forced to study in Germany, fortuitously, as it would be a country that solidified his early reputation as a prominent member of the international avant-garde. But I believe he remained self-conscious about his identity, especially his religious identity, for much of his life. This is what he looked like as a young adult when he went to Darmstadt to study architecture in 1912. On the left and on the right, with his buddy Asif Zadkin, who was a very important literary figure in the avant-garde. Despite his modest family origins, which were both deeply intellectual on his father's side and strictly religious on his mother's, Lissitzky presents himself as a serious, dapper academic, despite his limited finances. Later, from 1916 to 19, as he passed through his core Jewish period of drawings and book design, participating with other Russian Jewish artists in the development of a national Jewish style, he adopted the more ethnic-looking guise of a bohemian Jewish artist in a smock and sporting a lion's mane beard, as we have seen. 1919. With the toppling of the Tsar came a halt to the pogroms and zoning restrictions for Jews, and for a while, frankly, the Bolsheviks had bigger fish to fry. So Lissitzky maintained this persona, working first in the art division of Narkompros, which was the Commissariat for Education, in Kiev, which was then part of Russia, as President Putin would like you to know, where he became politically conscious. If you don't know, the Ukraine, and particularly Kiev and Odessa, are among the largest Jewish capitals in Russia or former territories of Russia. He became politically conscious, making Yiddish and Jewish book designs and continuing to when he was invited by Chagall in 1919 to head the departments of graphic printing and architecture at the Vitebsk Popular Art Institute, where he soon became aligned with Malevich. So you realize we're covering a lot of physical territory here. Kiev is in the south, Vitebsk is in the high north, so even for an artist without a job to travel those great distances meant something. Where he soon became aligned with Malevich and the abstract artists of UNOVIS, the Cyrillic acronym for the champions of new art. As we know, it is here in 1919 that he comes under the sway of suprematism and invents the geometric works that he later terms crowns. That's Project for the Universal Understanding of the New. The interchange station between painting and architecture, which despite their shared formal characteristics with Malevich's work and soon thereafter with the constructivists and European abstract artists, became increasingly distanced from them in both theory and practice. By the time Lissitzky moved back to Moscow in 1921 to teach monumental painting and architecture at the Higher Art and Technical Studios, he reverted to the appearance, his own, of a more conservative, conventional persona. Cut his hair off, shaved his beard, put on a suit. One that I believe allowed him to more easily assimilate in metropolitan Moscow, as opposed to the isolation of rural Vitebsk, and when he once again travels to Europe, to more easily blend in there as well. At the end of 1921, Lissitzky left for Berlin via Warsaw, the first of many trips he made to Germany in the 1920s. Most Western and Russian sources claim that the Russian government sent him there. This view is exemplified by Helmut Putz's 1990 Vanadi Museum catalog, where he writes, quote, "This was not an escape from government politics. He seemed, on the contrary, to have taken on the job of cultural representative for the Soviet government," end quote. Noting at the same time that there is no source or documents that confirm this claim. Well, I found them. More than a decade later, the Stedelijk Museum's Kharchev collection catalog put a more nefarious spin on his Western travels. Quote, "He promoted the new Russian art in word and image and may have engaged in espionage while doing so. He was a true believer in the new world he was helping to build," end quote. They must have found the same stuff I did. But in his various biographical notes, Lissitzky omits any reference to government service until later, when he is commissioned to build pavilions and design propaganda posters. Was all of this a persona shifting and assimilation into different contexts part of the tradecraft of a government agent? Or rather, was he eager to embrace different ideas and participate as part of an international avant-garde movement where he could let loose his seemingly genuine passion for socialism? Somehow I think both of those things are true. According to Nikolai Kharchev, in an infrequently cited interview, it's easier to write these things than speak, I'm sorry. An infrequently cited interview with Rubel Golubkina in 2002. And Nikolai Kharchev, I should just explain, this was written for another context. Nikolai Kharchev was one of the great collectors of the Russian avant-garde in the early 20th century, a friend to all of the artists, knew them firsthand. His voluminous collection was acquired, he says, by gift. Some say otherwise. And it lives partly at the Stedelijk Museum and at the Tretyakov Gallery, and will ultimately be in the full collection of the Tretyakov Gallery. But Kharchev is a major figure for understanding this period for lots of reasons. So when he gives an interview, it's important to listen. He said, quote, "He went abroad and did so because he had fallen in love with the artist Polina Khentova." That's her. And this is Man Ray's portrait of her. "She was incredibly beautiful, Jewish, without looking it. She was a fashion plate, dressed beautifully, always in furs. I don't know where she got the money. Lissitzky was madly in love with her, but she was completely indifferent to him. Perhaps because she appreciated him only as an artist. Because of her, he tried to commit suicide. The shot went through his lung, and as a result, he was a sick man all of his life. No one knew about this, so Lissitzky's widow told me. It's hard to imagine Chentova as Lissitzky's wife. He was small, she was voluptuous. Through the literature on Lissitzky's biography, he's been described as having and dying of tuberculosis. He never had tuberculosis. He had a punctured lung, and that's why he spent years at a sanatorium in Switzerland. So I guess, he died for love. How great is that? If Lissitzky was leaving his Jewish identity behind, either to endear himself to Chentova or to better assimilate in Western and Russian contexts, he had a conscious or unconscious way of allowing his religious roots to remain embedded in his practice. In recalling Lissitzky's stopover in Warsaw en route to Berlin, the Polish constructivist Henryk Bodewy recalled, Lissitzky often came to my studio on Sonortskaya 38, which was filled with pictures, drawings, and the proofs for ornaments and jackets for Jewish books, all of which was essentially imbued with a Jewish atmosphere. One could say that a mystic Hasidic spirit dominated my studio at that time, and that a remote echo of the Dibuk reverberated in every corner. The suprematist message had a strange sound to it in these mystical Hasidic surroundings. This is still him. But over time, while Lissitzky let his eloquence unfurl and sang hymns in praise of this art form that I was then still unfamiliar with, defending suprematism as its true apostle, I increasingly felt drops of this poison enter into my soul. His glowing and direct words had an impact on me as if it were hashish. He held up before me a mirror of mysterious magical images of crystalline purity, exuding luminous clarity of this new art. As a true enlightened one, obsessed by his new religion, he passionately devoted himself to propagating the doctrine of this art form that had risen in neighboring Russia. Berlevy's reference to a mirror suggests that he recognized something familiar, even himself, in the works Lissitzky showed him. No doubt the crowns he was steeped in creating. It was in 1987 that, as a graduate student at Yale, that a brilliant medievalist, Walter Kahn, first suggested I look into the relationship between the crowns and the Kabbalah, an esoteric set of teachings originating in Judaism meant to explain an unchanging, eternal, and mysterious Ein Sof, infinity, and the mortal and finite universe, God's creation. What I found was that, at least through 1925, Lissitzky incorporated references to Kabbalah and other obscure Jewish theology into his secular work, either overtly or covertly, as I've said earlier. Concetus, the reigning expert on Lissitzky's Jewish work, believes those few of us in the West who dare to go here have overplayed the argument. And I'm not saying that every crown Lissitzky made has a Jewish subtext. Nevertheless, he never completely let go of his religion, in spite of his passion for the Russian Revolution, or perhaps because of it. And even some of his colleagues in the West eventually turned against him because he was Jewish. One of the first projects he began working on in Berlin in 1921, 2 years after the turn to abstraction, was Ilya Ehrenberg's Six Tales with Easy Endings, which was finally published in 1922. Ehrenberg was a very significant Russian avant-garde writer for many decades, ended up in Paris. While the other 4 illustrations and 3 other extant collages don't contain any ostensible religious references, this one does, and not just because of the Hebrew letters. The newspaper clippings are taken from an ad for the Hapag, later Hapag-Lloyd, shipping container company, not Jewish owned as far as I know. So you can see the name Hapag is pretty clearly above the lowermost banner at right, left, with the company's castle logo on it, while the American flag and UAL banner refer to the New York-Hamburg route collaged at the right and left sides of the main composition. As to the content of this composition, the Hebrew letters inscribed in the palm of the hand, which could be Lissitzky's imprint, reduced monoprint impression, have no inherent meaning as far as anyone has been able to determine. But knowing Lissitzky, nothing is arbitrary. The configuration of the hand is that of a rabbi or Jewish elder when giving the blessing. Alan Birnholz was the first to suggest it was connected to the Kabbalah in the 1970s in his article, Lissitzky and the Jewish Tradition. But even he backed away from that, writing, "Were he alive today, Lissitzky would disagree most vehemently with my interpretation. Lissitzky considered himself a modern revolutionary avant-garde artist who had successfully and completely broken with the past." In other words, another Martin is backing off the religious connection. And we do it all the time, because it's easier to see our modernists as being in the religion of art, not in somewhere else. Later, Shimon Abramsky jumped on Birnholz, writing, he completely misunderstood that, thinking it was the Kabbalistic text, obviously not knowing Hebrew, because he's American. He invented an unfounded theory of the influence of Kabbalah on Lissitzky, end quote. Indeed, were it derived from that source, it would look like this two-hand configuration, which spells out shorthand for Yahweh, which means God in the Kabbalah, and signifies an abundance, or to emanate, or to flow. Now, a clock face appears partially in the background of the collage, signifying the passage of time, like a journey on a ship, and helping to formally unify the elements in the composition. It has both a mundane and a metaphysical resonance in this context. Following consultation with rabbinical scholar Avner Kramer, I have for the first time been able to identify the Hebrew text diagram beneath the hand and overlaying the clock. It is sourced not from the Kabbalah, but from the writings of the 12th century Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, or Maimonides, he also went by Rambam, who was also a philosopher, astronomer, and a physician. In other words, a polymath, who was Sephardic and straddled both the Jewish and Islamic worlds, just as the polymath Lissitzky strove to straddle East and West, secular and religious. Still working on the text's meaning. It's a little cryptic. It's only a page taken from a larger whole. I mean, the whole book is about 500 pages, so there's a lifetime of work ahead, and not for me. I'm closing it. I'll just close this very quickly. 1922 proves to be a pivotal year for him. His collaborations with Ehrenberg continue with the publication in spring of a combined volume 1 and 2 of this periodical. And, you know, since I'm running over time, I think I've established the groundwork for what I want to argue. So I'm going to depart from my notes and just breeze through the images. So, 1922. Remember, later he's still making Chagall-like Jewish drawings. And in 1919, he's already making paintings that look like this. Not necessary. really not necessarily fascinating. So these are the Proud paintings. This is, by the way, in the Museum of Modern Art. Sold out of his show in Berlin that I just showed you a slide of. And he's making these book designs at the same time. So 1922, all of which is after Consedicus's book on his Jewish period. This is it's in Hebrew, but it's a book of Yiddish folktales. 22. You remember the design for the magazine I showed you a few minutes ago? That's the form on the right. This is a book from Ukrainian Soltes. This is his letterhead, which he doesn't design until 1924. This is his self-portrait, which he doesn't make until 1924. He gets into this rhythm of image making that puts the human figure at the center of a circle, and you're going to say, oh yeah, like Leonardo's Vitruvian Man. It's not. It comes from the Kabbalah many thousands of years before Vitruvius. And, well, I know there are a lot of fakes and so forth of Lissitzky's work. I've been able to identify at least 8, I'm just showing you a few, of Lissitzky's works which work with this motif. And he doesn't repeat any design in his work like this at all. So it's obviously meaning something. And even in his letters, I just want to sort of end with this letter where he uses the square, the diagonal, and the circle abstract symbols to refer, I have it in my notes, it refers to, here it is. He's writing to Theo van Dersburg, with whom he had a falling out, the Dutch style artist. Now you know that the one I hung, now that you know that with one lung I try to burn with more strength than with 2, so that the square, life, is transformed into a diagonal line, infinity. Given that the line moves more rapidly, because I hope to have some time left before the arrival of my black circle, death. Sorry it got truncated, but
a really most fascinating talk with many possibilities for interpretation. But we now have our third speaker, Dr. Ari Soltes, and so please welcome.
Jerusalem, the point and purpose of which was to create a national Jewish art. It failed to do that. It led to the beginnings of what would eventuate as Israeli art. But it failed to do that because, for the same reason that one can't, over a century later, define Jewish art, because one has to begin by defining what Jewish is, and whether you mean by that a religion or a culture or a nationality or a body of customs and traditions or an ethnicity or a race or a civilization. And it begins by having to ask whether you're talking about the art itself or the artist. And if you're talking about the art, are you referring to its symbolic language or its subject matter or its style? Or if you're speaking about the artist, you're talking about the artist's identity. And not only can one ask, in the case of someone like Lissitzky, who never ceases to be Jewish throughout his whole life, and that's exactly what Matthew's point is, but who may or may not, depending upon who's reading his work, see a continuation of a Jewish identity embedded within it. But someone like Fritz Ascher, who nominally at least converts out of Judaism, raises the question of whether that person's art continues to be Jewish or was ever Jewish in the first place or ceases to be Jewish. And of course, you could ask the question in reverse of someone who converts to Judaism, who is an artist, whether that artist's work suddenly becomes Jewish or not. The golem is a creature that by tradition is understood to have been created by Rabbi Judah Loew in Prague in the late 16th, early 17th centuries. Rabbi Loew was renowned for his knowledge of esoteric Kabbalah, medieval Jewish mysticism, or in his case, late Kabbalah. And it was that esoteric knowledge, his knowledge of the ineffable name of God, his knowledge of the different ins and outs of how to truly understand God's name, and how to apply that knowledge to practical purposes, that enabled him to create a creature, an anthropomorph, of dirt from the river, from nearby the river, analogous in a sense to how in Genesis God created the first creature of earth, Adamah in Hebrew, Adam. But whereas God breathed its neshama, its psyche, its anima, its spirit into Adam, and so Adam became the soul, the golem, it's a word from the Psalms that means formless, shapeless. The golem had, depending upon which version of the tale or subversion of the tale you believe, the name of God placed on a piece of paper, the ineffable name of God known only to Judah Loew and not to ordinary people, placed in its mouth or inscribed across its forehead, or the word for truth in Hebrew, emet, using consonantally the first, last, and middle letters of the Hebrew alphabet, inscribed across its forehead or on a piece of paper in its mouth. In any case, the point and purpose of mysticism, as every mystic and certainly every Jewish mystic knows, is not to achieve your own enlightenment, but to improve the community around you, or ideally the whole world around you. And so the word that late Kabbalah uses, taken from the rabbinic literature in Hebrew, is tikkun. Ideally tikkun olam, fixing the whole world, but at least fixing something around you. And that's the point and purpose for which Judah Loew created the golem, to kind of improve the lot of the Prague Jewish community that was very much at risk in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. And so the golem fetched water and chopped wood, but more importantly protected the Jewish community from hostile Christian neighbors. And so it played a kind of local messianic role for that Jewish community. And the problem that eventuated is that it's the ability to be controlled only by Judah Loew meant that if the golem that responded emotionally to situations, so that if it was harmed it would fight back, and it was a Frankenstein. In fact, the story would inspire, among others, Mary Shelley to write that novella. It couldn't be controlled. And one day Judah Loew is out of town and it goes out of control. So the rabbi has to decommission it by, again, removing the piece of paper from the mouth, or effacing the name of God, or the first letter, the aleph, leaving mem taf, met meaning dead. And so the creature is dead. And its body placed up in the attic of the old new synagogue in Prague, so that at some point in the future when it might be needed, it could return to be helpful. Well, in theory, of course, in the centuries that follow, the need for such a messianic character would have been felt to be less because as we move through the 18th and early 19th centuries, an era of revolutions, industrial, technological, scientific, political, philosophical, theological, one of the outcomes of that is that Jews experience in many countries in Western and Central Europe what we call emancipation. That is that from the edges of society to which they have been relegated for 1,500 years or so, they are brought into the mainstream because these countries consider themselves to be, as it were, less Christian than post-Christian or more secular, and therefore the religious basis for keeping Jews out made no sense. That doesn't mean that the embrace was full-fledged by any means, however. And it's part of what inspired that lack of full-fledged embrace. Someone like the father of Karl Marx in 1824, when young Karl was only 6 years old, to convert his son to Protestantism with the sense that as a Jew he'd have no future in the Prussia of which they were part and the Berlin of which he was part. And one can see of Marx as one follows his career that there were a lot of ambiguities and confusions within his identity. His first adult post-PhD treatise is on the Jewish question, and on the other hand, he certainly didn't think of himself as Jewish, but on the third hand, others did. So it seems that even though he was from the age of 6 nominally non-Jewish, he was yet considered Jewish. By the way, all 4 of his grandparents with whom he spent those summers came from long rabbinic lines. I'm sure when he spent summers with them, they didn't say, yes, yes, you're a good Protestant boy, Karl. Quite the contrary. In any case, things changed 50 years later. In 1878, a Prussian by the name of Wilhelm Marr, a political pamphleteer, takes out of the linguistic vocabulary the term Semite, which had been used to refer to a family of languages, Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, Ugaritic, and the like, and transferred it to an ethnic racial kind of category, and labeled Jews as Semites, meaning they can never be Prussians, they can never be Europeans, they can only and always be outsiders, they can only and always be others, they can never be us. So racial anti-Semitism could now legitimately replace a more traditional religion-based anti-Jewishness, although that still existed. Blood libels, even in Prague, the city of Judah, at the end of the 19th century, there was a case in 1899, and of course, in late Tsarist Russia, the Belis case, popularly known as the Fixer, thanks to Bernard Mellon and the like, indicated that that sort of sensibility also still prevailed. So in short, the fin de siècle that carries us from the late 19th to the early 20th century, filled with all kinds of cultural and spiritual forms and sources of malaise, included among them an unresolved issue with respect to where the Jews fit in. The Golem emerges as a really popular figure during this period, a very popular idea. So that Yudel Rosenberg, a Jewish writer and rabbinic scholar, came out in 1909 in Hebrew with a book about the Golem, which he claimed, of course, was not his own, but that the son-in-law of Judah Loew, Rabbi Katz, had actually authored it, Isaac Katz, and somehow it had gotten down to him. 4 years later, he translates it into Yiddish, so that even Jews who couldn't read Hebrew because they weren't scholarly enough could read it. 2 years later, in 1915, or 1917 rather, 4 years later, Chaim Bloch, another Jewish writer, created a whole novel called The Golem, in which he altogether ignored the fact that Rosenberg's editions had even existed. And the general theme was this, that Judah Loew, accompanied by the sexton, Rabbi Abraham Chaim, Abraham Life, and his son-in-law, Rabbi Isaac Katz, using highly esoteric Kabbalistic formulae at midnight by the riverside, shaping this creature, saying the ineffable name of God, and other kinds of esoteric formulae, and walking around it clockwise 7 times and counterclockwise 7 times, created this anthropomorph. What Rosenberg and Bloch in turn added to the tradition of particular interest and note for this conversation is that there's a wicked priest by the name of Thaddeus who has it in for the Jews. There's a benign cardinal by the name of Jan Sylvester, and Emperor Rudolf, the Habsburg emperor, was, of course, benign as well. So you have a lot of black, white, good, bad kind of guys involved in this story. And it captured so much of the imagination In 1914, Wegener, the great German expressionist film actor and director, produced the first of 3 versions of stories about the golem with himself in the leading starring role. And in 1915, Gustav Meyrink, who was a non-Jewish writer, told the story of how he was almost on the verge of suicide when someone slipped something under his door about occultism. It got him interested in that subject, and he ended up writing his version of the story of the golem, in which instead of a rabbi, we've got a Jewish jeweler by the name of Athanasius Pernath, who is the key figure. And so it goes on. So that's the world into which Fritz Ascher was born in 1893. And by 1901, in a manner reminiscent of Karl Marx and his father, Ascher's father does not formally convert, but leaves Judaism, whatever that means, without having formally converted to Protestantism. It's not as if he joins a church, he kind of leaves the synagogue. With the kids, with Fritz. Interestingly, mom doesn't do that, just as Karl Marx's mom didn't. Although the mother will, later on in 1926, 4 years after her husband's death, formally leave Judaism as well. And again, it's not clear why at that point, and exactly what that means. Except it would seem clear that in the case of Ascher's father, like Marx's father, it was a concern that my little babies are not going to be able to get anywhere in the world in spite of its ostensive embrace of us, because we're past these religious prejudices, because somehow one form or another of them still seems to exist. So Ascher, by the time he is a teenager, is very interested, of course, in the arts. And by 1913, 14, 15, he is actively engaged as a painter. Elizabeth mentioned how Max Lieberman, who was the leading light in the German world of painting in that time, and the connection between Germany and other countries, who was Jewish but not actively Jewish, who would in the end, of course, have to leave his running of the Dusseldorf Academy of Art as the Nazis came into power. Just a hop, skip, and a jump before they would have thrown him out anyway. So they certainly knew he was Jewish. So Fritz Ascher in 1916 comes up with this extraordinary painting of the golem, and we wonder whether it at all might reflect anything about his sense of confusion or ambiguity with respect to his identity. Did I mention that he and Meyrink were friends, that they both worked on this satirical magazine, Simplicissimus? So he was certainly aware of these traditions that had reemerged in the previous 20 years or so. And we've got, as you can see, the golem in the backdrop, hovering over, or towering, I should say, over these 3 characters, the central one of whom we might take to be Judah Low, and the ones to his side, one the sexton, one the son-in-law perhaps. But it's interesting how all of the 3 in the front in particular have such, well, they're almost ghoulish in their expressions. Their teeth, well, they could use some work, couldn't they? In unusually large hands, which Elizabeth pointed out already is a feature that Ascher seemed to favor. The golem almost looks more human than they do. And he looks us straight in the eye. They're looking off to the side. Is that because they can't stare us in the eye? Or is it because they're aware of something off the side that we're not aware of, like that wicked priest Thaddeus is somehow approaching? It's hard to know. The golem can be seen as protective, he can be seen as positive, he can be seen as hulking. He's got an interestingly yellow pallor, and yellow, of course, has a long history in Christian art as being associated with Judas and therefore with betrayal. Is it a Judas color, or is that just, as Elizabeth has pointed out, he, as others like him, have taken colors in new directions? The buildings in the back and the fact that all of them are wearing skull caps, others than I have pointed out, would have suggested to a modern secular Jewish viewer from Berlin of 1916 that these are Eastern European Jews, backward Jews, Fiddler on the Roof kind of Jews, other, foreign, not what we are. Or put another way, you could say that to the extent that this may be seen as that sort of a vision, he's doing visually something analogous to what Karl Marx had done in his handling of the Jewish question. 2 essays, the first one of which excoriates Bruno Bauer, who writes on the Jews, and in a sense defends Jews, but the second has been actually called anti-Semitic because it buys into typical Christian stereotypes regarding Jews. All they care about is money. Okay? That's what the second essay is about. So is this the way we would see Jews through Christian eyes as these Eastern European others who aren't part of us? Or is it the golem as this kind of messianic figure? And this is an era, I remind you, of unusual messianic figures for the Jews. The same time period is the time period of the Zionist movement. And the father of that movement, Theodor Herzl, certainly saw himself and was seen by his supporters as a kind of secular Messiah. So is this another not secular, but localized kind of messianic figure? Hard to say for sure. But one of the things that we're aware of, as Elizabeth pointed out, is that Ascher did a lot of images that have an apparent Jesus or Christological kind of content to them, but never are they simple and straightforward the way traditional Christian images of Jesus are. So this image of Golgotha, in which Golgotha itself and the 3 figures on the cross barely make it into the picture frame, although there is that blasting sun coming up, the new dawning of a new day behind them, but all that does for them is to make them almost invisible to us as far as details, because we stare at the sun and then we only see shadows. I mean, what are the main figures we see? We certainly see this large figure to the right with the spear in his hand, on horseback. We might suppose that that's Longinus, the Roman soldier who speared the side of Christ and then later became the first pagan convert to a belief in Christ as the man, ecce homo. It's interesting that he shares a very similar kind of face to the main figure in the lower center, with his hand upraised, almost touching that spear. But that figure also lines up with Christ, and that figure notably has a very bright red beard. Part of the Christian tradition understands Jesus to have, and you see him portrayed sometimes with red hair, because of his descent from the house of David. And because when we encounter David, the first time he goes out to battle against Goliath, he's referred to as being red, Adomi, as well as being good looking and what have you. We have within this extraordinary morass, this chaos of people, no one whom we would obviously find in, you name just about any image of Golgotha in the Christian tradition, you're gonna find at least one of the following: the Virgin Mary, Mary Magdalene, one of the other Marys, Martha, St. Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus. None of them is at least apparently present there. So he's removed what is most obvious, and he's put front and center this rather interesting character who, by the way, with that stereotypically Jewish face, but shared in terms of its features with Longinus' Roman face, with his hand upraised, is wearing that blue that Elizabeth has already referred to for us as a particularly spiritual kind of question. Color, rather. So is this painted by a Christian painter, or is this painted by a Jewish painter, or is this painted by a painter who is kind of a mixture of both? I should point out that one of the changes coming subject matter-wise into work by Jewish artists born, grew up, died Jewish, is the image of Jesus. So Moses Jacob Ezekiel, the most important 19th century American sculptor, and his counterpart from Russia, and they actually met in Berlin, Mark Antokolsky, both did images of Christ. And at the other end of the spectrum, nothing is more famous, I think, than the image that Chagall produced in the year of Kristallnacht, 1938, the White Crucifixion, at the Art Institute of Chicago. So that subject, as it were, but handled in a different, less than traditional way, would not have been unique, except this is certainly unique in terms of the verb and the power that it gives to it. Let me show you a second Golgotha image, which you were also shown briefly by Elizabeth, the Golgotha and pageant. Here, at least, we get a clearer view of Christ and the two thieves. He even has a halo, but oddly off to the side, not front and center, and composed in a kind of diagonal manner. So running parallel to that is this long diagonal procession, that's the pageant, and if we go from back to front, well, the half of it that leads us exactly to the center of the page reminds us of pageants found all over Europe, particularly around Easter time, in different villages and towns, with the pennants that stand for the different parishes. In Italian, these are referred to as the contrade, the most famous being in Siena, where you see that procession having taken place twice in the course of the summer, and a full-sized figure of Christ. They're struggling to hold it up, which is why it's sort of tilting, it's not straight up. And then your eyes come forward to the center lower part, and it's like, what, excuse me, are we looking at here? This naked female with a kind of halo of her own, with her hands raised up. Oh, is this the Orans position? Well, I'm not so sure about that, because we can recognize the priestess, whether it's in Crete, whether it's in Mesopotamia, whether it's in Egypt, with her arms raised up toward the god, whichever of the gods one speaks about. And in fact, if you look at the figures holding her palanquin, all of them have these naked torsos, well-muscled, shaved heads that should remind us, if anything, of Egypt. So is this some sort of a subversive reminder of the fact that one of Christianity's beginning points is paganism? And then what about to the right, when we look over the shoulder of all the audience, so to say, in the lower left, of which we become part, that clownish figure, that baiazzo? Is this about, I mean, suddenly this religious procession looks a little bit like the beginning of Carnevale. Well, Carnevale was farewell to the flesh, the beginning of Lent, the beginning of this long period of self-sacrifice until we get to Easter, but of course it's become so damn commercialized that, of course, whether you are in Italy or whether you're in New Orleans or whether you're in Brazil, is this a comment on that, of the sacred having been debased to become overly secular in this different kind of theater, from the theater of which religion has always been a sibling as far back as we can trace it? Of course, Ascher made a lot of baiazzo images, clowns, typically clowns that weep. So I entertain you while I'm weeping inside. Leoncavall's opera, Il Pagliacci, the clowns, had first been performed in 1882, so he grew up on it and in the atmosphere of it. And he seems always to have been drawn to lonely figures of different sorts. We've seen briefly St. Anthony, perhaps being tortured, perhaps being tempted as a torture. We also might compare this St. Anthony to, come back to me, where are you? Maybe we'll have to do it this way instead. To the tortured, which Elizabeth discussed so brilliantly, of course, with his red hair, by the way, with his heavenly blue body. Is this a Christ image that is not a Christ image, that is a Christ image, that is not a Christ image, surrounded by these four figures, by the way, giving us the total of wounds, 5 figures in Christ's body, if we're talking about symbolic language? Is that what it is about? Oh, by the way, the 5 books of the Torah in the Jewish tradition, the 5 pillars in the Muslim tradition, just lest we get too encapsulated. And if you look at some of his studies, such as this one and this one, for the St. Anthony, you realize it's hard to tell the difference between, for the tortured, it's hard to tell the difference between St. Anthony and tortured, because ultimately what might have had, in a different context, a strictly Christian sensibility has become more generalized, or rather crosses lines between Christian and non-Christian, Christian and Jewish. In 1938, Kristallnacht, he is arrested, sent to Sachsenhausen. We don't know for sure whether it's because he's Jewish or because he's a degenerate artist. He gets out, he's in Potsdam prison, then he's free for 2 years. Then his parole officer says they're going to deport you. He goes into hiding. And in hiding, and I'm almost finished, in hiding he writes poetry. He no longer has access to art stuff. Crucifixion, he writes. 3 crosses tower into the heavens, clouds sweep along. The storm shrieks, swirling downward, the light endures, the soul to all the world directed. Yet these there, tarrying and brought low, stifling the dust, and a wonder shuddering touches them, a huge presentiment, loss. Clown. The masses storm around here, benumbed, mute, he stays sunk in himself. Only this slight smiling one might discover, spoke of all the agony that lay piled in him. Sunset. The golden roundness sinks softly, glimmering. It inflames all the distances, bleeding until they turn gray. Nimble as sheep, night's gloom has happened. Ascher's work after the war is freer than ever and as burdened as ever, completely disconnected from his Holocaust experience, his Jewish experience, and yet it's deeply embedded within every painting. His work has nothing to do with his experience and, of course, everything to do with it. The setting sun is nature, or is it a stand-in for God? And the profounder question regarding God's existence and God's justice, theodicy, asked by both Christians and Jews with a passion unimaginable in the era when Ascher was born, provoked by the horrors of the Holocaust that so marked his life, that we see on the canvas before us. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Very provocative talk. We do have a little more time, so I'd like to ask all the panelists to please come up and sit here and be.
So much for all your talks. It was really interesting. I'm wondering, after listening to Elizabeth talk about color and the potential of spirituality, a very didactic, it seems, spirituality that's attained through color, and Lissitzky's also mysticism through form and the potential of geometry to incorporate this mysticism. I'm wondering if we could look at Ascher's line. It seems like his line is almost grotesque. The figures of caricatures. Just to me, I'm not an expert in this period or at all, but I'm wondering if there's something almost anti-spiritual about the form of his work, while there are other aspects that could be considered spiritual.
Well, Elizabeth, Ori, which one of you would like to go first?
Thank you, Abigail. It's a really interesting question.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. The question was if we're looking at color as a carrier of perhaps spiritual meaning or ideological meaning, and if we're also looking with the case of Lissitzky looking at form and the abstract forms as also carriers of spiritual or religious significance. Can you also look at the line as a counterweight weight to that, is that correct, and counterpart, because the line and his forms are sort of grotesque and kind of earthy, and is that a counterbalance to the more sort of an anti-spiritual, aspect to it? I think that's a really interesting point, and the thing that I find quite interesting is the fact that there are many interpretations of each compositional choice that can overlap with one another. So you could read, to me, the sort of grotesque and earthy aspect. I would almost read that sort of in almost like a Dubuffet-esque interpretation, where it's the essential of humanity, the stuff of people is perhaps maybe raw material, is not necessarily finessed, and what brings you up would be these other things. So you could read it either, I would think you can go both ways. It could be anti-spiritual, or it could be also a continuation of it. And I would assume that the multiple interpretations for each of the composition decisions coexist happily, unhappily, contradictorily, because it's, he's working in such in addition to his personal biography, right, he's working in this avant-garde milieu where it's 1,000,001 different influences all at the same time. So identifying, I feel as though you're never going to be able to get one singular explanation for, to me, any of the composition decisions of artists of this period, just because there's so much behind it, the long answer.
And I would say both. He can be spiritual and anti-spiritual at the same time. And I would think specifically of another of the artists with whom he was very close, Berkowitz, who lost her son Peter in the First World War, and that, of course, transformed her art. But if one thinks of the larger picture of us as a species to which artists are responding, from 1789 to 1914, when we think we're more and more, we don't need God because we got it all and we can do it all. And then the Great War proves that what we can do best is destroy each other. So the 20s is a period, certainly in Germany, but not only in Germany, which roars, not with ebullience, say I, but with escapism, escaping from ourselves. And I see Ascher as among artists, and he's not the only one, there's a whole list of them, and Elizabeth showed some of them, and there were still others in Germany, but not only in Germany, whose expressionism is a reflection of the harshness, the anti-spiritual, the godlessness of humanity that the war has shown, even as, because he himself is such a self-contradiction, we can still see the spiritual side of him pushing against that anti-spiritual side.
That answers possibly some of your questions. Now, are there other issues that someone wants to bring up or raise? Yes?
Yeah, I'd like to ask about the Lissitzky, the print image, the hand image with the two letters. For me as an Israeli, Pei Nun, those two letters, immediately say, here lies, that are on Jewish tombstones,
Right.
that says, here interned. And that was my immediate association, and I thought, I didn't mention it. So is that not a reading that was suggested?
Matthew?
It's such an obvious reference that nobody's mentioned it.
Could I add something else and ask your question?
I saw it and I thought, surely this much is known. So I've got to go underneath there and figure out what this.
It's just a poster by
But
an artist.
you're absolutely right. I mean, and
Okay.
a lot could be said about why that, right, in the midst of this book. Please.
Natan, because when I saw it, I thought, well, Pei stands for Pardes, which is the garden of mystical speculation, and Nun, perhaps Nivuah, prophecy, and I'm thinking of Abulafian Kabbalah, which is Kabbalah Nivuit, right, prophetic, and I'm just wondering whether, because that would also account for why it's not a final Nun, as if it's one word, but what do you think?
Pei Nun is abbreviation that appears.
No, I understand what you're saying, but I'm
which are
thinking
the
as a
two
separate.
letters for
Yes.
materialize. So
I know.
it seems almost like an icon as opposed to a specific meaning that he intended. He just took an icon that appears everywhere. That's what, just like a hand, it's as much as a handprint.
I want to say one more thing, just to add to the complicated complexion of this guy's biography. In 1921, Lissitzky went to work for Cheka, which is the inheritor of the NKVD, the former KGB, today's FSB. There's incontrovertible evidence of the date and this fact. It points to a lot of things in his biography, and I think points to a lot of things that begin appearing in his work at the same time that he's compromising. Where is he? We'll never know, because he never left a word about it. But I think that being Jewish was a way for him to reconcile being a spook.
Well, we should also say that Ehrenberg, for whom he did that 1922-23 book, he did the designs. He later confessed to being someone who worked for Cheka.
Ehrenberg recruited Lissitzky.
So, but there are always multiple reasons, we should say, why people are sometimes sucked in to security services. And particularly being Jewish in the Soviet Union, that's something that Cheka could really sort of play to their advantage. Now, there have been several hands, and you. Okay, so you had a question, I don't know.
Sure. My name's Richard McPhee. This is for, first of all, thank you. The exhibition itself is certainly fascinating and really kind of terrifying.
Rachel's very terrifying, she is.
But certainly hearing you and how you're kind of examining the contradictions and tensions in this man's life and most of course in his artwork, another artist simply jumps to mind. And I was wondering if you could see a parallel, or if you know any of other. And the other artist is Hyman Bloom. Mm-hmm. Very similar in terms of beginning with a certain amount of Jewish subject matter, a lot of tension in it, a man who's moving away from his community, then going off into mysticism, and in his last years coming back to some kind of Jewish subject matter. I just thought, oh wow, I mean, this is the European Hyman Bloom, or vice versa, whatever.
And I do see, even stylistically, there's some similarities. But so yeah, yes, I do see parallels. I think Hyman Bloom was disadvantaged by the fact that the institution that maybe would have promoted him, the Jewish Museum, reached a point in New York where it didn't want to show things that were too Jewish. And anyway, he was from Boston, doesn't count, right? So, but yes, I do see a number of parallels in the sorts of things that you're talking about. Yes. But not in their lives.
No,
but in their art. Yeah.
Is there any other artist you can think of that has that kind of track? Ben Shahn.
I guess Ben Shahn would fall, a different style, but that kind of track. Yeah. Well, you could argue Lissitzky, we was just argued, right? You go from Had Gadya to Crowns, which are supposed to be completely secularly non-anything, and then of course Matthew demonstrates that on the contrary, they have any amount of Jewish content to them, so he's wrestling with that part of his identity his whole life. So
couldn't we say the Crowns were something, the affirmation of the new Soviet Union? So
true, but why is he hiding or not hiding Jewish stuff?
Isn't it also very Jewish to be making abstract images?
Right.
Yeah, but Picasso and Braque weren't Jews.
Picasso and Braque weren't Jews, and they weren't making abstract
Cubans? Oh, you mean completely abstract?
Non-objective.
Was Kandinsky? No.
Sometimes he wasn't Jewish.
No, I said he's
he
not
wasn't.
Jewish, but he's the one who...
There's always multiple reasons, but this woman in the back, I mean, she had her hand up for a long time, so.
Thank you. First of all, many thanks for this very inspiring presentations. It was it's very good to be here. My question is, you have been discussing the identity of the art or the artist, whether you could say it's Jewish or a Jew that has turned away from his religion. So it would be very difficult to ascertain what kind of identity he has. To what extent do you think Fritz Ascher is a German artist? Because why am I asking that? Looking at, when I was in the exhibition, what struck me very interesting was you were talking about the spiritual colors that he uses to depict certain emotions and also refer to philosophies or ideas. But the figures that he paints, they are very earthy, they are very strong, and it reminds me, maybe because it's my German background, it reminds me very much of German ways of depicting figures, because they are so present. By contrast, for example, if you look at the work of Lissitzky, could you say he's also a German artist, and to what extent?
Absolutely unequivocally. Absolutely unequivocally. The two are not, they don't contradict each other. They're both aspects. It's like the question, do we call them Jewish American artists, American Jewish artists? Do we use a hyphen? Do we not? African American? I mean, it's that question that is, of course, humanity-wide for people who have diverse elements of their identities, and Ascher's a good example. I mean, is he first in trouble because he's a degenerate German artist, or because he's a Jew even though he hasn't been Jewish since 1901 nominally? That's just a technical question, but you're absolutely right with respect to his art. I couldn't agree more. He is, to whatever extent he may or may not be called a Jewish artist, he certainly can be called a German artist.
Well, particularly you can connect him with the type of paintings in Germany that were called Expressionism, like the group of artists that both of you showed. Anyway, Elizabeth, do you want to have anything to say about that question of Germanness, if there is such a thing?
Well, I think just a second before his point. I mean, I think that they're not contradictory aspects of where you see identity within these works, and I just, yeah, 100%, I agree. I think he is very much a German artist. You could trace him within the German tradition, but you could equally also trace him within. I mean, very clearly he's looking at Michelangelo. Very clearly these bodies have a sort of pan-European trajectory to them. So I feel that the tricky question for any moment in which you are trying to look at a work of art and read identity through it, unless it's very direct, obvious, etc., right, is the fact that, you know, there are so many different ways you can ultimately go, and there's so many artistic influences, and is that a function of identity? If you're looking to Italy versus France, if you're looking to Germany, does that mean your statement of yourself versus yours? So I think you absolutely can say that he's a Jewish, there are Jewish elements to his work, perhaps, or Christian or religious, or etc. You can absolutely say he's a German artist, but you can also definitively say he could be a million and one other things. Less articulately, already said so.
I believe that this man had a question. Am I wrong? You had your hand up before?
Yes, I just wanted to, you mentioned that Ehrenburg was also working for the Chekhov.
Yeah.
No, he was an agent of influence. He never worked for Chekhov.
He said he did in his memoirs.
He did. He was an agent of influence, and but he never got the direct orders to do this and that. I would say he knew what to do.
Right, yeah. There are many degrees of how an individual
I mean,
is
not everyone would say that
obliged.
Trump is an agent of Putin, right?
Right.
It's another question. I have another question.
Yeah, there are two hands over here.
Just
but
a quick
finish.
question.
Yes.
Then regarding the, just remember I read the Henry Kane autobiography, and he just summarized his conversion. He said that my conversion to Christianity is a ticket to the civilized world. I think that summarizes every single thing.
And he, on his deathbed, rued having done so nonetheless.
And we should really say that before the Shoah, before what happened in the Second World War, there were many, many Jews in Europe who did think about converting as to be more accepted. So the time that we're talking about is quite significant. Now, there were other hands, and I believe you, and then you.
If you could, either one of you, talk about their connections with Bauhaus, their impact or influence, if you could do that.
Matt, you maybe.
Well, you know, the Bauhaus started out as a cult. Before Walter Gropius arrived, people were holding incense-burning, spiritual, meditative meetings. That didn't last very long, because it didn't generate very much income for the school and other reasons. Gropius came in and instituted a program of, you know, using new materials and new languages in art and architecture and design, and made it a trade school. So people like Joseph Albers and Lissitzky and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and Annie Albers and hundreds of artists were either in residence as teachers or came through there as lecturers, and a fair number of Russians. I mean, Malevich's Bauhaus book was published there in, 1925, I think, designed by Lissitzky. It was not, you know, there was no accident. All these forces converged. And in a way, you know, Lissitzky talked about his paintings, these browns, which no one's ever gotten the hang of pronouncing. Somebody called them prunes the other day. As an interchange station between architecture, design, painting, photography, whatever. But that's really what the Bauhaus was. It was an interchange station. It's where painting got off, crossed the platform, and went over to the design car. The guy in the design car or the woman in the design car got off the car and walked to another track and did photography. It was all happening on the move. So it was truly an international school.
And then, of course, with the advent of Hitler, so many of the faculty and students from the Bauhaus did come in exile to the United States.
They came to Chicago.
from
They opened a Bauhaus in Chicago because Hitler said, the German roof is not flat.
Yes. Now that, yes, you had your hand.
I was interested.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. What happened to Lissitzky, some of these, after what we know about Ascher, but what happened to him in World War II? Did he go back to Russia?
Oh, he died in 1941 of tuberculosis.
Oh, I see.
But he didn't have tuberculosis.
So he died in the Soviet
He died in Russia. His wife, being a German national, was exiled to Siberia, where she passed away. But interestingly, she wasn't stuck in jail like most German nationals were. The war was on. I've suggested why that might be the case.
Maybe you'd repeat it.
Well, she was exiled but not arrested because her husband was a spy.
I see what you mean. Okay, another question. Yeah.
In line with the question about Ascher's Germanness, I was wondering if we could address the idea of biography as a method for examining his work. It seemed like Elizabeth provided an alternative vision with thinking about color and how that fits into the broader history of art during this specific period. And the other two papers looked at biography still as a major method. And I guess this is like a constant discussion currently in the field of art history. So I'm wondering what you think is most productive for continuing to think about him as this nuanced artist who could be a lot of things at once and could be read in a lot of different ways. And as Elizabeth said, maybe we'll never know everything about him, as it's probably impossible about any artist. But at the same time, what do you think are the most productive
I think this is actually something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, not necessarily in relationship to Ascher, but in relationship to other artists. There's a sweet spot, I feel, between how much do you impose sort of the artist's biography as the way to understand his or her work, and how much do you look at the work itself and let that guide you to a network of, formal, aesthetic, social, cultural innovations. And I think part of the sort of myth in sort of polarizing those sort of approaches, those two sort of methodologies, whether it be sort of artistic or biographical, is the fact that, well, they're all informed by each other, right? You as an individual and your biographical narrative, the choices that you make are informed by your context. Well, it's not just your context that informs what you do, but it's also, your biography and your influence. So everything is interrelated. But the question then becomes, when you're articulating an argument about what is the meaning of this particular work, where is that balance? If you go too far into biography, do you risk marginalizing the artistic, contributions, and therefore the artist is completely marginalized because they're relevant only for who they were. If you go too far the other direction, well, with Lissitzky being a good example, if you take away that aspect of his identity, well, you've missed, perhaps 50% of the interpretation. So it's not an answer, but I think the thing is that I don't know what the answer would be, but there has to be something where you feel as though you're doing justice to, I think, the complexity of the person and the work and how they do relate to each other. So that's a non-answer.
I disagree. I think you gave an answer.
Okay.
Obviously, with some artists, we have much more biographical detail than with others. But I don't think it's either or, it's both. You can't ignore the biographical information that you've got when you've got it. You can't ignore whatever is available to you. With Ascher, I'm thinking of the poetry that he wrote as an example that gives perhaps some aperçu into his painting concerns. But at the same time, you have to look at the art as art and answer the question in terms of its color, its shape, its form, its style, its brushwork. I feel that we still remain under the shadow of and cursed by Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg and their analysis of the abstract expressionists, which was, it's all about form. Bullshit. They weren't just about form. They were artists responding, and they could not respond to what had just happened from Auschwitz to Nagasaki. Come on, Clement. Come on, Harold. And it turns out that they're in their studios talking about this stuff. He wants to ignore all of that. That doesn't mean that what Pollock is doing or what Rothko is doing is not spectacularly dynamic in its own aesthetic reality. But to deny that you've got Pollock reflecting on the reality that the world has just been through, and that you've got Rothko trying to put the world back together on the canvas, is specious. So I think it's both, absolutely. And you do the best you can. And it's always interpretation, as with everything, as with the Bible, as with literature, we interpret.
Matthew, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Where would Picasso be without a biography?
Well, we'll have time, I think, to maybe have one more question, and then we could allow people to come up and talk to the individual panelists. So,
I thought what you just said, it's sort of facially explains a great deal about Lissitzky. I mean, we have to think of him as a person whose behavior is important in interpreting what he did. I mean, a person who would go to work for the checkup is a person who's interested in disappearing and complicating everything that he appears to do and say. And that theme seems to run through everything that he produced, all of these layers of interpretation, but nothing that can be absolutely pinned down to any one cause.
And you can be wrong about that, but that's okay. It's a good interpretation.
No, actually,
Right.
I think the seeds of Stalin's first 5-year plan are embedded in the first PCB. I think you're right.
the hope for a new era. But I think we can conclude by thanking these wonderful and also thanks to you audience for being a wonderful, wonderful audience. So please, if you have other questions, come up and ask them.
See you again.